Hello, this is Yvonne Zaragoza, and I am going to present my final presentation for Education 606 for Social Movements in Campus Activism. The title is The Vietnam War, Protests in Higher Education. I'd like to take a look at the social movement from its earliest inception to its current organizational structure. We're looking at a protest movement that began in spring of 1965 with teach-ins and with marches in Washington, and it went towards the spring of 1970 and beyond, but we're going up to the spring of 1970 with the American incursion into Cambodia. So there's earlier information that lets us know that protests had already began, and some of those protests took place in New York, according to Kennedy. I would like to look at three stakeholders, and the major ones are going to be students and faculty, university administrators, and the U.S. President and his administration, and the U.S. government as well. So there's a quote from Alinsky that I really like, and he captures the lack of communication and the condescending communication that's coming in, and people are going to either object to it or they're not. So with this, I'd like to compound this with a daily record of now we're in Cambodia, now we're not. Now we are not in it, but we're over it with bombers, and we will not get involved there as in Vietnam, but we can't get out of Vietnam without safeguarding Cambodia. We're doing this, but we're really doing the other, with no other clue as to all this madness except the half-helpful comment from the White House, which is, don't listen to what we say, just watch what we do. Half-helpful, only because either statements or actions are insufficient, and they make us freeze into bewilderment and stunned disbelief. So we're going to look at some of the student protesters, and they are protesting the anti-war movement. They are protesting student dissent and unrest on campus. They are for the free speech rights of students, and they are against the student disciplines that are taking place on campus. The organizations that we're going to be looking at, they really rely on SDS. Now, SDS is the Students for Democratic Society, very vocal during this time, and there were approximately 300 chapters, and that's only 15% of the college campuses. We also see involvement from the Young Americans for Freedom, WEB, the Block Club, Students for Free Speech, and Students Against the Klaba Act. Klaba Act being an act where students were limiting who should speak on campus and on what subject line, and what's being known as the New Left. With this, we're seeing a lot of students who are questioning the liberal ideologies of the nation's universities, primarily SDS. They provided a manifesto named the Port Huron Statement. We read this in class, and again, just questioning their values, their beliefs, and how they want to see change. McGee also points out that in the early 20th century, grounded partly on rebellion against the conventions of society and partly in criticism of the university itself, students are speaking up. They are not staying quiet, and the university administrators are seeing this as the unknown area of student discipline. So we see aggressiveness on the students' demands, we see activism on the student demands, and we will go into this with the following sections. Faculty also protested. They had their own anti-war sentiments. They were looking at some of the policy violations taking place at the university, and they're questioning funding, a lot of negotiations, and a lot of questions on grant money, where it's coming in. Some of the faculty at the University of Indiana, they formed a group called Negotiation Now. They also had a committee for peace in Vietnam. Those committees formed nationally, and many were for peace in Vietnam. So as we look at some of the quotes that came in from the readings, one of the big ones is the discontent that came in and was rooted within the McCarthy era. So, with this loyalty oaths, with this dismissals for communism, the government's increased role in funding university research, there's a lot of questioning, and there's a big gap forming between the faculty and administration. And a lot of this questioning comes into the concentration of the sciences, which we'll also go over in Dow. And with the University of Illinois, an ad hoc committee, they led a opposition against the war by writing a letter to President Lyndon Johnson calling for a halt in the bombings of North Vietnam. So faculty were very vocal, and through writing to scholarship journals and just providing their information to the community and documenting this historical movement, they too were involved in protesting. One physical involvement that I can go ahead and share, where faculty and students assembled at one of the events where 400 faculty went against the Illinois Union for a Berkeley Vietnam Day Committee event on October 1965. They picketed a football game. They also gathered in front of one of the buildings to just demonstrate against the bombing in North Vietnam. So they were visual, they were writing articles, they were writing the president, they were very much involved. The university administrators and the refusal to address students' concerns. This was one of the major defaults for a lot of the protesting that took place on campus. Their lack of intervention among city ordinances and violations. Their need to call in the police and the deputies to address student unrest. The use of police force. These student arrests that took place on campus, and even having university buses ship the students to jail. And a lot of poor communication with parents, a lot of policy violations. This was not handled properly. University administrators relied on Big Brother to handle their grievances against students. And Wincup shares that while the Board of Trustees and the Faculty Council congratulated the administration on its actions against the Dow demonstrators, the Student Senate charged Dean of Students Robert Schaefer with violating the Student Bill of Rights, violation of due process, and just general lack of fairness. So we'll go over this on some of the themes that are going to be coming. And again, some more quotes on what's taken place with administrators. They are allowing violence on campus, student arrest. They are punishing students for protesting on campus. And the Board of Trustees just thinks it's another reason for them to implement new policy that was not in favor of the students, such as expelling students who engaged in violence or threats or what they believe was a disruption to the university work or life or activity of the campus. The U.S. government and its president. We had a lot going on, a lot of involvement against the students. We had Richard Nixon, who was elected to president. We had Washington lawmakers making policy changes against the students. And we had the National Guard coming into campus and just bringing in their ammunition, and just also the local police, the sheriffs, the CIA, FBI agents, they were all involved one way or another. The governor, just a lot of poor communication. So in 1965, the Johnson administration linked anti-war demonstrations with communist agitators, while the Selective Service System attempted to reclassify the status of anti-war demonstrators. These are students. The legislation branch joined the fray as well, barring financial aid to students convicted of rioting and legalizing federal wiretapping and eavesdropping in 1968. A lot of lack of access for students' privacy rights, and this violated so much of the students' ability to be able to stay out of jail. Here's some of the contributions that the U.S. government just produced a lot of negativity towards the student body. We had shootings. We had students killed. We had the National Guard come in. We had riot gears come in. It's this very anti-student, pro-administrator, and there's a lot that we're going to be learning as the presentation goes on. There are three major themes that really take shape protesting on campus. One of them will be on the draft. The other one is on ROTC buildings on campus and Dow. So we're going to be going into that as well. So with the draft itself, I just want to point out what Cardin Lamolle let us know, that the induction of a draft lottery system was set by the president, and his high priority for being drafted out were any delinquents. The second one were volunteers, and the third one was non-volunteers. So we don't see college students there, and we'll see why. So with college deferments, we have a lot of students who began attending college to avoid the draft. There was an increase in enrollment rates for young men. Also, there were disobedience tactics that took place, such as sit-ins and draft card burnings, which eventually became a felony. So with that said, February 1st, 1968, we had students Stephen Schmidt and Mark Cooper who were arrested and charged because they put up a draft counseling table to help students understand why they should defer their draft, why should they stay in college. And while all this is going on, we have students who are burning their cards at the their board of trustees meetings. We have these acts of symbolism where they're burning their cards on campus to let people know, defer the draft. Then we have the ROTC buildings, and students were already against the war, and they then began to be against the military being on campus. So there were demands where they wanted ROTC off the campus. They were not neutral to the institution or to the war in Vietnam. And there were strike committees that were just taking place everywhere. There were, burnings of ROTC buildings, or threats of burnings of ROTC buildings to capture the attention of the administrators. So at Jackson State, they attempted to set fire to an ROTC building. They did not, but with that said, there was still violence that came in from the National Guard, that came in from the local police against the students. Where it did burn down was at Kent State. They burned it to the ground. There were 1,000 student activists who surrounded the building, and they made it be known that this building needs to be out, and they do not want the military on campus. Now the Dow Chemical Company. This is where a lot of the grant dollars are coming to the universities. This is where faculty are fighting against grant money coming in, the sciences being engaged with grant dollars. We've got Dow Company who manufactures napalm and chemical defluents, and they are bombing people in Vietnam. And these chemicals are being made at the universities. And not only that, but then Dell's also coming in to recruit students to go work for them. So students are now rebelling against this. We don't want to be involved in the war. We don't want our college or university to be manufacturing these items. We do not want to kill the people from Vietnam. We do not want to see the aftermath because of this. And not only that, we don't want our students to be employed by them. They wanted no association. They were willing to block room entrances where students were going to go into interviews. They were willing to defy the president on whether he would be speaking on behalf of the Dow Chemical Company. And there were a lot of confrontations. So on November 1st, over 100 students went into the president's office to protest the police action and to argue that Dow used the university's facilities to recruit. And in this, we saw people jailed. We saw people that were incurred head injuries, were hospitalized, and this was just a part of the protest movement. So now we'll look at some of these social activism and the context. In the United States during this time, there is still shock, awe, hurt, and a lack of understanding for what is taking place in this world. We have the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We have the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. We have the killing of President John F. Kennedy. And with all this, we also have an immediate war that's taking place. And it is televised for the first time in U.S. history. It is costing lives. Almost 60,000 U.S. dead are missing. We have 5 million Vietnamese that are dead. And all of this and more is taking shape as far as the social activism that's taking place in the U.S., primarily in higher education. So some of the arguments for social change, I'm going to bring up the first one. And one of the biggest ones was it all began peacefully through grievances, through rallies, through letter writing, through picketing, and nobody was hurt. Then we had a Vietnam Summer Project that was headed by Martin Luther King Jr., where he opposed the war. Faculty and students took this and they really raised it to a high level nationally. They too were against the war, and if they had their leaders speaking against it, they were going to do the same. And what we also saw, arguments for change, was racism was still alive and well in the U.S. McGee explains about the media attention for Jackson State, where African American students were shot at, were killed, and a lack of televised media attention was given to them. And for Kent State, because white students were killed by white officers, which was really uncommon in America, they gained the majority of attention. So these arguments for change is, we have two different type students, two different type universities, one white primarily, one HBCU, all of them fighting for their own civil rights, also the Vietnam War, yet one area is going to be televised more than the other. So the ways the movement worked for social justice, the biggest one that really had everyone involved as much as they could was a draft. Nobody was against the draft. So nobody picketed against the draft. You either went to war or you did not. And the ways that they got this to work for the social movement was educating people about it. How do you capitalize on information to know how many units to enroll in, how to defer the war, how long do I need to be deferred for? There were just a lot of variables there, and students were out there working to educate students on how to defer the draft. So the philosophies and theories behind the movement, There are many. We're going to start with Van Dyke, his personal and just overall. So, overall, he's going to tell us that student activism tends to occur at elite schools, at large campuses, and the mechanisms used explain the social movement theories at that time, namely individual predisposition theories and breakdown theories. What does that mean? Privilege. A lot of these students come from a political background. A lot of these students are privileged by families who are well educated on the political system. So they're able to really capture this protest movement compared to others who might not have the means to go to college, might not have social capital to help students get into college. Furthermore, how to protest a war they don't understand. So Van Dyke uses his own social movement theory to explore the factors that influence the location of student protests and develop a hypothesis that the history of activism is strongly associated with student protest. Some of the tactics used. Well, some of the tactics used were being able to begin a peaceful movement. Students at Jackson State met at Dr. Peoples' office, a campus administrator. They wanted to speak with him. They thought they were going to speak with him. Next thing you know, there's police gunfire and gas canisters and students' death on campus. They knew that campus police had already attacked. They already knew that they were being treated unfairly. They had civil rights violations that were occurring, yet they continued. They did not stop. They wanted something changed, and they were willing to have it changed. Unfortunately, their tactics created some negativity for students that died. Wynkoop also tells us that students really did understand that they were up against disciplinary action and even arrest, not death, but they knew that they would be arrested. So what did they see? Police dragging out students, police hitting them with riot sticks, leaving them with bruises. They're willing to sacrifice themselves for change. So, challenges of the movements. A lot of these were what resulted in death and injury. We know that on May 18th, 1970, there were 150 shots at students, 2 deaths, 12 injuries. Not even a week before, we saw the same thing at Kent State, and 4 students were killed. There was just, death was a challenge because no one expected that. That was not on a policy, or that was not expected, I should say. And the triumphs of the movement? Well, there was a lot of coordination with students. So students at Illinois were able to work with students at Berkeley, at Wisconsin, at Michigan, and there were a lot of people within the SDS student organization that were working together. Also, policy began to change. The first one that hit was a relaxation of the student housing conditions. Students could no longer be scared by police to go back at a curfew. Students were winning, and they were winning slowly, but they began to see change. Also, when a university president at San Francisco State University decided to call in the police for student protest, that came to an end towards 1968. He had to resign because they were just not going to tolerate that anymore. And was the movement successful? Yes. I mean, that nationally, we saw people participating in Washington, going to the nation's capital. There were students not only at individual universities, there were mass gathering, and the movement was being televised, it was growing, and everybody was fighting for one critical, peaceful demonstration against the war. And Kent State, I do want to point out that even the numbers showed success. So on May 4th, on the day that the students gathered to burn down the ROTC building, there were 3,000 students congregated. Only 500 protested, but 1,000 changed their views, and about 1,500 watched. So you've got not only a level of curiosity, but you've got students who are now coming through and seeing that they need to be informed. They need to be a part of the social movement. My recommendations on how the movement may have been improved. During this time, we still have the civil rights movement ongoing. There could have been better coordination, that students that were fighting their civil liberties could have worked with the students who were fighting other themes, other issues. If they had come together, I just think that this movement could have been coordinated a whole lot easier and better. Students are being arrested for trying to create change with university policies and financial aid. And we've got students who are going to jail for acting out against the Vietnam War. If everyone would have just come together as one, we could have seen a stronger movement and more media attention. So I'm going to share a little bit of data, and just to let you know, there were a lot of SDS protesters, especially on Dow. So about 300 of them were protesting, and then another 250 were pro. So there was a balance of very equal views. And when it came down to the voting, 361 were anti-war, and 117 were 361 were not anti-war, and 176 were against the war. And I'm just going to let it go at that. For drafters, we had a cohort of what they call 1951 for 20-year-olds, which increased 1.45 enrollment. What did that mean for graduation rates? Well, half of those students graduated. So although they drafted or deferred their draft, they didn't really graduate. About 0.9% went on to have a transcript, so to speak, to be college students. And with the Vietnam War, there were some surveys that went through. 38 were against the war, but about 34 were also fighting housing issues. So that's not very different. People were not going to jail for housing issues, yet that percentage is fairly close. Also, with the military efforts in Vietnam, there was a student opinion that was drawn where 20% of students wanted to step up military efforts and 60 did not. 11 had no opinion. So these numbers varied by school. They varied just by year, and the numbers ended up looking very unsatisfactory. They couldn't rely on the data that showed that a high number of students were really against the war or not, because there was no balance. There was no equal point. As far as faculty, 18% of them wanted to withdraw immediately from Vietnam. 40% wanted to encourage a coalition. 33% wanted to reduce involvement and prevent communist takeover, and 8% just wanted to defeat the communists. So also, the numbers just show that not everybody was on the same page. So here are my references, and also just a little bit on my dad. He went to war, and he did come back, and he experienced a lot coming back, and now I have a better understanding of what he had to endure during his time. So here we are, and I want to thank you for listening to my dialogue.